Ukraine sits on nearly a quarter of the entire world's supply of Chernozem, the black soil considered the most fertile on Earth. It also holds massive reserves of iron ore, titanium, and natural gas, a well-educated workforce, and a coastline that opens straight onto European trade routes. By every textbook measure, Ukraine should be one of the richest countries on the continent. Instead, for over 3 decades, it has been the poorest country in Europe. Not one of, the poorest. Poorer than Moldova. Poorer than Albania. Poorer than countries with a fraction of its resources. How does a country holding a quarter of the world's best farmland end up this poor? What actually broke Ukraine's economy? And was it really the wars? Or had this country already been failing long before the tanks rolled in? Ukraine sits on some of the most productive black soil Chernozem in the world, a resource so valuable it's earned the country the nickname, the breadbasket of Europe. That soil was worth stealing. For years, selling farmland itself was illegal in Ukraine, yet the topsoil could legally be trucked away and sold. And one estimate put the black market in stolen Ukrainian dirt at roughly $900 million a year. When criminals are hauling away your soil by the truckload, that's not a sign of a poor country, it's a sign of an extraordinarily rich one that can't get out of its own way. Add to that huge coal and iron ore deposits, a sizable industrial base inherited from Soviet-era heavy manufacturing, and a population that was, at independence, well-educated and highly skilled in engineering and agriculture. It also had geography working in its favor, a Black Sea coastline for exports, direct borders with the European Union. On paper, this is a country with every ingredient for prosperity, a natural trading hub. In 1991, Ukraine declared independence from the crumbling Soviet Union, finally free to run its own economy. By the early 2000s, the currency had stabilized, exports to Europe were climbing, and foreign capital was flowing in. By 2007, absolute poverty was gone, and growth was hitting nearly 20% a year. For a brief window, this looked like a genuine success story. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis hit developed economies hard, but it hit developing, resource-dependent economies like Ukraine's even harder. Foreign investors, spooked by the crash, pulled their money out of risky emerging markets to protect their positions at home. Demand for Ukraine's raw material exports collapsed alongside global demand. The result? The Ukrainian economy contracted by more than 30% in a single year. A brutal reminder of what happens when your entire growth model depends on selling resources to the rest of the world. You rise when global demand rises, and you crash when it doesn't. If 2008 was a warning shot, what followed was a cascade, each disaster arriving before the last one had even been recovered from. Beat 1. Invasion, 2014. Russia annexed Crimea and backed separatists in the Donbas, 2 of Ukraine's most productive regions, gone overnight, along with the factories and infrastructure businesses across the country depended on. A month before the invasion, the central bank had floated the currency. After nearly 20 years pegged to the dollar, it lost over 70% of its value within months. To the outside world, the message was instant. Ukraine is no longer worth the risk. Capital flight, foreign money that had taken a decade to attract vanished within weeks. GDP more than halved in 2 years. The human cost behind every one of those percentages was someone's savings account losing most of its value overnight, a worker losing their factory job after the plant fell under occupation, and a family deciding whether to stay or leave their home. In the 1990s alone, over half the population had already been pushed into absolute poverty once before, and for many Ukrainians, 2014 felt like watching that nightmare return. Corruption, the side of the story rarely shown in war footage. Ukraine has long struggled with corruption, ranking among Europe's most challenged countries on this issue. Alongside nations like Brazil and Colombia, one former president's own cabinet estimated corruption was draining nearly $10 billion a year from a $155 billion economy, before he himself became embroiled in corruption scandals. When the IMF offered a $17.5 billion loan after 2014, only a fraction was ever paid out, because Ukraine couldn't pass the safeguards lenders needed. To trust the money wouldn't simply disappear. Instability pushed skilled workers abroad in search of something more stable, taking talent the economy needed to recover right when it needed it most. Here's the concept underneath all of it. An asset only creates wealth if someone can legally use it as collateral. Consider this. From the early 1990s until 2020, it was illegal to sell farmland in Ukraine. The policy was meant to protect small farmers from being bought out by oligarchs and foreign corporations. But it had a brutal side effect. Farmers could lease their land, but they couldn't use it as collateral for a bank loan. A farmer sitting on some of the richest soil on the planet couldn't walk into a bank and borrow money against it, the way a Kansas or French farmer could. Though the tractors, irrigators, irrigation, and modern equipment that would have multiplied that land's output simply never arrived for most small producers. That's the whole Ukraine story in miniature. Having titanium in the ground, or the best farmland in Europe, means almost nothing if the legal and financial system won't let you convert it into working capital, or if outside investors don't trust their money will be safe once it's in the ground. Corruption and war do the same damage through different mechanisms. One drains money through the back door. The other makes the front door too dangerous to walk through. Either way, the resource just sits there. By 2025, Ukraine's nominal GDP had climbed back to roughly $210 billion, technically higher than its 2021 pre-invasion level. But that number is misleading. Adjusted for real terms and wartime inflation, the economy had only recovered to around 79% of where it stood before the full-scale invasion. GDP per capita sits close to $6,500, still among the lowest in Europe. Growth has been slowing rather than accelerating. After rebounding sharply in 2023, growth fell to just 1.7% in 2025, the weakest pace since the invasion year itself. With forecasts for 2026 sitting around 1.3%, inflation remains high, near 9–10%. The central bank has held interest rates at 15% to try to contain it. None of this growth is happening on its own. External financing, mostly Western aid and loans, covered over $52 billion of the economy in 2025 alone. Meanwhile, the price tag for actually rebuilding the country now stands at nearly $588 billion over the next decade, according to a World Bank assessment released in early 2026, figure roughly 3 times the size of Ukraine's entire annual economy. International oversight remains the central issue standing between Ukraine and that money. The IMF and EU have tied continued financial support to anti-corruption reforms, and Ukraine's valuable visa-free access to the EU depends on maintaining credibility on that front. The president has positioned himself as a reform-minded leader on corruption, though those efforts have inevitably taken a back seat to simply keeping the country running during wartime. Best case, a durable ceasefire holds, and the nearly $588 billion reconstruction bill gets financed, with real international oversight attached, meaning contracts, audits, and anti-corruption courts strong enough that Western firms are willing to build factories, not just donate generators. Growth accelerates past 5% a year as displaced Ukrainians return and rebuild, echoing how South Korea used post-war reconstruction to industrialize in a single generation. Most likely case, the fighting winds down, but doesn't fully end. Growth grinds along near the 1–3% range it's running at now, and the country stays dependent on roughly $50 billion a year in external financing just to keep functioning. Reconstruct happens piecemeal. A rebuilt power station here, a repaired rail line there, funded project by project, rather than through the single large wave of investment the $588 billion price tag actually calls for. Worst case, renewed escalation, or a stalled peace drags the war past 2027. Energy infrastructure keeps getting hit faster than it can be repaired, and donor fatigue in the West starts to shrink that $52 billion annual lifeline. Corruption reforms quietly stall once wartime unity fades. The IMF pulls back further disbursements the way it did after 2014, and Ukraine ends up structurally dependent on aid indefinitely instead of transitioning to it. Natural wealth is not the same as economic wealth. A country can hold a quarter of the richest soil on Earth and still be the poorest nation on its own continent, because economies aren't built on what's in the ground. They're built on whether ordinary people can legally turn what they own into capital, and whether outsiders trust the system enough to invest in it. Ukraine banned land sales for nearly 30 years, specifically to stop oligarchs and foreign corporations from buying up its best farmland. And that same law is a big part of why ordinary farmers couldn't get loans to modernize. Was that trade-off worth it, protecting small farmers from exploitation, even if it meant the whole country's most valuable resource stayed underdeveloped for a generation?